Greetings ladies and gentlefish, and welcome back to another tank review. We're still at tier 5. Can you tell I've been playing a bit of tier 5 recently. And today we're going to look at the tier 5 Czechoslovakian medium tank, the Skoda T-24. Czechoslovakian line is a line, along with the Swedes, that I've been very slowly chipping my way at. And we finally get up to a tank that I would consider it worth doing a review of. Generally speaking, these days I don't bother with a review of anything below tier 5 because people can normally just get through it so fast. It's kind of a waste of my time unless there's something interesting to say about that particular machine. Anyway, the T-25. So, historically, what do we have? Well, this is a bit of a weird one. So, Skoda is a Czechoslovakian manufacturer, and Czechoslovakia was annexed by Germany in 1938. So what you have is quite a prominent engineering company and arms manufacturer that was beholden to the Germans. But the Germans didn't actually like the idea of non-German parts of the Reich, I suppose, making their own stuff. And so what you tended to find is that companies like Skoda were just asked to pump out copies of existing tanks, essentially. This one was a little bit different. So when the Germans encountered the T-34, although it wasn't quite the panic that some people seem to think it was, the Germans could deal with the T-34 and the KV-1. But there was some interest in trying to get a tank that could go toe-to-toe with the T-34 frontally. And so what they did was put out a requirement for companies to design a new medium tank capable of doing that. And Skoda was not included in that particular requirement. That requirement would eventually lead to the development of the Panther. But what Skoda did was manage to get their hands on some T-34s that had been knocked out by the Germans in action, and they went about designing tanks that could counter them. And they would submit these designs to the Germans and see how far it went, basically. And there were sort of two designs that the Czechoslovakians ended up, or Skoda ended up putting forward. The T-24 and the T-25. This is the T-24, and the T-25 is at tier 6. And in the end, they both had 75mm guns. They were both able to take out the T-34 frontally, at least in concept. They both had pretty sloped armour. And what the Germans did was they ended up saying, look, the T-25 would be our preferred of these two designs, and so development on the T-24 project was stopped. This thing only ever made it as far as a wooden mock-up, didn't get any further. And that's essentially what you have historically. In-game, what do you get? Well, this is a bit of a weird one because the Panzer T-25 has been in the German tech tree as a premium for ages, and despite the fact that it claims to be a T-25 and looks like a T-25, it functions more like a T-24. It's a little bit weird. Go figure. Anyway, let's go and have a look at the statistics and armour of this thing. Right, so let's have a look at the Skoda T-24's stats then, and I'm going to be comparing this with the Japanese tier 5 medium tank, the Chi-Nu, because I think there are some similarities there, and the Panzer T-25. Although that thing is a premium tank, it's kind of, before the Czechoslovakian tech tree was introduced into the game, this was the closest you got to the Skoda T-24. So this is the tank that you might think on paper would give the closest comparison. Straight off the bat, you can see the base DPM on the Skoda T-24 sucks. It absolutely sucks. Less than 1300 is abysmal, compared to over 1500 for the Chi-Nu and over 1600 for the Panzer T-25. We're not off to a very good start. Penetration of 132 with your standard AP rounds, compared to 124 on the Chi-Nu and 116 on the Panzer T-25. The Chi-Nu has relatively good penetration for a tier 5 medium tank at 124, and if you were comparing it to something like the 76mm gun on the Sherman, that'd be 128. The penetration is actually best in class on the Skoda, but it's still, it's not by a huge margin. Like, you have 4mm over the Sherman, you have 8 over the Chinu. It doesn't feel like it makes much difference. Damage of 110 is not completely terrible for a Tier 5 medium tank. There are certainly other Tier 5 medium tanks with that alpha damage, but it's definitely not great, and the Chinu has it beat. Panzer T-25 is the same. Module damage is the same across the board because they're all 75mm guns. Here's the bit that's really curious. If you compare the Skoda and the Chinu, the Skoda gets worse alpha damage at 110 compared to 125, and it gets a worse rate of fire. That's why the DPM is so abysmal, at least in the Panzer's case. It has worse alpha damage, but it has a much better rate of fire, giving it better DPM. No. The Skoda gets worse alpha damage and a worse rate of fire. So the damage output is hideous. Now, the shell velocity is a little bit better than the others at 900. That is not bad for a Tier 5 medium tank, but again, it's not amazing. It's not going to rock your world or anything. Ammo capacity 60, 6.6k potential damage. I mean, it's a Tier 5 medium tank, it's fine, but if you're in a drawn-out game, you can start running low on ammunition. So, gun stats, and this is where, well, things get a little bit better for the Skoda, I suppose. Aim time of 2.21 is the same as the Chinu, better than the Panzer T-25. Dispersion, so that's your accuracy when fully aimed at 0.36, is almost as good as the Chinu, which is pretty good for a Tier 5 medium tank, worse than the Panzer T-25. The accuracy fully aimed on the Skoda T-24 for a Tier 5 medium is actually rather good. And the gun handling, the dispersion when moving, turning the hull, turning the turret, are all better than the other tanks in this comparison. So what you have is a gun that's relatively accurate with relatively good gun handling and good penetration, with mediocre alpha damage and appalling DPM. Elevation is 20 degrees, depression is 10 degrees gun depression across the board in this case. Let me just tell you from experience, you don't really notice the better gun handling very much compared to a lot of the other Tier 5 medium tanks. You do notice, and you don't really notice the accuracy that much, you do notice the poor alpha damage and you do notice the long reload. Just putting that out there now. So, in terms of mobility, and yeah, it's not bad for the Skoda here. I mean, the Chinu, in this comparison, is not a particularly mobile tank, so it's better than that. 58 kilometers an hour forward, 18 backward. That beats the Chinu, but is worse than the Panzer, interestingly. 450 horsepower engine, giving this thing a power-to-weight ratio of 23, which is a bit better than the Panzer, and considerably better than the Chinu. Terrain resistances are also pretty respectable. Well, I say pretty respectable. Let me rephrase. I don't know why I said pretty respectable at all, to be honest. The terrain resistance is 1.25 on hard terrain, 1.44 on medium, 2.01 on soft. So they are comparable with the Panzer T-25, apart from on soft terrain. Now, the Panzer T-25 is not known for having good ground resistances. The Chinu has much better ground resistances than the Skoda, and so what you end up with is a situation that the power-to-weight ratio of the Skoda makes it appear more mobile than it actually is, because the ground resistances are not very good. And the power-to-weight ratio on the on the Chinu, makes it appear less mobile than it actually is, because the ground resistances are actually pretty respectable. Now, when you wrap all that up into a big ball, combine that with the tank's decent base traverse speeds, and what you get is a tank that turns well, has a respectable speed limit forwards and backwards and whatnot. It's respectably mobile, but it's not as mobile as 23 horsepower to ton would make you initially think. Just bear that in mind. Armour and health then, and Skoda T-24, we're going to have a look at the armour in a moment, but 50 on the front, 30 on the side, 30 on the rear on turret and hull. This is comparable to the Chinu, and this is actually worse than the Panzer T-25. The armour just isn't very good, but we'll look at that more in a moment. The bit that really gets this tank in terms of durability, though, is that it has 590 hit points. Even the Chi-Nu gets 630, and the Panzer T-25 gets 800. This is, I think it would be fair to say, one of the most fragile, possibly the most fragile, Tier 5 medium tanks. And that becomes a problem, because you end up having to play this thing quite carefully. In terms of camouflage, this thing beats the other two tanks in this comparison, in any old situation, so it's relatively sneaky, though the differences aren't enormous. Fire chance at 20% is pretty standard across the board. The Chi-Nu is slightly better, but it doesn't matter. Shell cost, I mean, this isn't a big thing, but considering you only do 110 alpha damage, the shell cost is actually a bit pricier than the other tanks in this comparison, but it's not a big thing. And just to pick up on what I was saying a moment ago, this is a list of all the Tier 5 medium tanks ordered by hit points. So we're going to see in a moment that the armour on the Skoda T-24 is not very good. What about the hit points? How does it compare with the rest of Tier 5? Because of course the hit point values of a lot of the mid-tier tanks, or all the mid-tier tanks, was changed not that long ago. So right up the top, we have tanks like the Matilda Black Prince, the Matilda 4, and actually the Panzer T-25 that are rocking 800 hit points. It's quite a lot. So where does 590 for the Skoda T-24 put it? Well, let's just keep going. Yeah, okay, so we've got to the Chi-Nu here, and the the Skoda is actually right down here toward the bottom. 590 is joint worst in class. To be fair, along with other tanks, the Type T-34 has 590, T-34 590, but both of these get better armour. Stridsvagn M42 590, and so on. So it's not the only one, but most of these tanks that have the same hit points have much better armour. That's the problem. Ignore this just some sort of placeholder tank stat. I don't know what that is, but ignore that, it doesn't really matter. So worst is what you need to know. So armour then, and it's a pretty bleak story. If you've got high explosive, you can probably penetrate this thing from the rear, which is the only reason I'm showing it, bearing in mind the typical penetration on 75mm HE rounds is about 38. The rear of this tank's 30, and the turret, and it just gets worse from there. Sides 30. Yeah, high explosive wrecks this thing, like 10mm on the engine deck, or the turret roof. So what about frontally then? Is it a better story? Well, remember that 50mm of armour? It has 50mm at an angle of about 37-38 degrees, giving you effective armour protection somewhere in the 60 to 70mm range on the hull. The lower front plate is actually a little bit stronger, bizarrely. Front of the turret, flat as a pancake, pretty much, and 50mm. Again, concerningly, 105mm howitzers firing HE rounds typically have about 50 penetration, so you can and will get penetrated frontally by those, even if they're not firing heat. Gun mantlet, well, it does offer potentially a little more protection here or there, in some places less. Remember, that's going to be a hole in the turret, but it's not really something you can rely upon. Perhaps somewhat paradoxically, the strongest point of armour on this thing is the commander's cupola at 95mm. Typically, you would expect the commander's cupola to be a weak point, and the hull or turret to be strong, but no, this is the strongest piece of armour on the entire tank. I'm just going to let that speak for itself. Right, so with the Skoda T-24, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just take a look at things like equipment, consumable, crew skills, grind, and whatnot. We'll kick off with the grind. This grind is in some ways a little awkward, in some ways relatively straightforward. So, unlike some tanks, you don't need the top turret before you can mount the top gun. So that makes the top gun an obvious priority, and it is a priority I would recommend you going for, because the stock gun, I mean, the penetration's alright, and for a stock gun anyway, and the alpha damage for a stock gun's alright, and everything else about the gun sucks. So I would recommend getting this top gun as soon as you can. The problem is, once you have the top gun, it has even more atrocious DPM than it does with the top turret, so you really want the top turret to make the top gun suck as little as possible. Let's put it that way. Engines, With the top engine and fully upgraded, this is a fairly mobile machine, but without, it's a little sluggish, as you might expect. That's true of a lot of machines. So you do want the top engine. Radios, ordinarily, you'd just say, get the radios last, it'll be fine. But in this particular case, the stock radio has a signal range of 345 meters, which is not very good, and it does mean that you can lose contact with some of your allies. So, where does one end up coming to on this grind? My advice would be, prioritise the gun, then prioritise the engine. Whether or not you want to prioritise the top turret before the top engine, I'm going to leave up to you. Then the radios and the suspension. I still think you want to go with that sort of order, even though I think the upgrading the radio on this tank is more important than it is on some other tanks. But that's the grind, in my humble opinion. And you're not going to have the mid radio already unlocked because you don't use it on the lower tier tank. You're not going to have the engine already unlocked, so this is a properly stock grind. Unless you're going to burn some free XP on it, of course, which is always an option. So, what about equipment and consumables? I've got your standard set of consumables. You could, I suppose, if you really wanted to. I probably wouldn't bother with the gasoline because you're already relatively mobile. You could take the food consumable, bush tea in this case. I'm probably hideously mispronouncing that. I apologise to anyone out there who is from Czechoslovakia. But then the question is, do you really want to be using that, which if you buy it full price is 20,000 credits a pop. Obviously if you get it half price it's half that, on a tier 5, or do you want to be using it on a tier 10? So I've got your standard 3 consumables. Directives, you could say exactly the same thing, so I'm not even going to bother talking about them. Equipment, now this one's a little bit more interesting. I definitely think you need a gun rammer. The DPM on this machine is so woeful, you need to do whatever you can to make it a little better. I also think you probably want either either coated optics or binocular telescopes. Now, this tank is fairly mobile, so I think you can afford to spend some time sitting in a bush rather than buzzing around everywhere. And also, because you have a base view range of, 350 meters, I think it is, with the top turret, 350, it means you're going to struggle to get a really good view range out of this tank without using binocular telescopes. Even if you have the most amazingest crew in the world, and you have all the bounty and bond equipment ever, I think you're going to, you'll get a decent view range out of it, but you're going to struggle to get up to 445. And let's be honest, who has a crew that good on their tier 5? I'm sure there are people out there who do, don't get me wrong, but not me, and certainly not this tier 5. So I would recommend binos, but I leave that up to you. Third equipment slot, I have tried vents and an improved rotation mechanism. Honestly, you don't notice that much difference between the two. I've settled on vents because at least it gives me an extra little bit of view range, for example. The improved rotation mechanism, you're not really too fussed about the traverse speeds in my experience. You're really after the dispersion improvement. And I've not really noticed that make a great deal of difference. This is a tier 5 medium tank, it sucks at snapshots anyway. You could try and make a case for some of the other bits of kit, for example, this thing doesn't have many hit points. Let's go improved hardening, 8% extra hit points, but 8% on top of rubbish is still not great. It doesn't actually do that much for you. I just think most of the other options are rather underwhelming. So I would be tempted to say for your third equipment slot either vents or an improved rotation mechanism. Some people will say, what about the improved aiming module? I want my aiming circle to be smaller. Bearing in mind, vents will do a portion of that anyway, plus also increase your view range, improve your reload and all that. So I would recommend vents over an improved aiming module. So my recommendation would be rammer, optics or binocular telescopes, and improved rotation mechanism or vents. The only other bit of kit you might be interested in is a turbocharger, because this thing does get pretty respectable horsepower, so an extra 7.5% on top of that is great. I don't know. I never felt mobility was this tank's problem though, so I would still probably recommend either vents or an improved rotation mechanism in that third equipment slot. Remember, this is a tier 5, so you don't get any category on your equipment pieces. You're never going to get the improved versions of equipment. Like your vents is going to be your vents bear is going to be 5% to all crew skills, not 6%. Your gun ram is going to be 10% to off reload time, not 12.5, and so on. That basically just leaves crew skills. Now, this tank is a little bit funky. There is something to mention here. Your gunner also acts as your loader. There is no dedicated loader on this tank. It's a 4-man crew, but the 4th person is a radio operator, which is a little bit unusual. If we have a look at the tier 6 here, let's just have a quick look at what crew it gets. Commander, gunner, driver, radio operator, so the same crew layout, but remember, because this thing packs an auto loader, it's not going to have a dedicated loader. There won't be the job of loader will be split across the rest of your crew, generally speaking, unless this tank's weird and does things a little bit differently, but I don't think it does, although now that I mention it, I really just want to check and make sure that I'm not telling you something that's simply incorrect. So just to make sure I'm not telling you porkies when it loads up, there we go. Crew, no! Okay, I stand corrected. The T-25 has the same layout. It is your gunner who doubles up as your loader. There's not a... in the French autoloaders, it's common for the whole crew to become a loader. So anyway, the point I'm getting at, in a long-winded way, is that if you've got a load of shiny crew members to recruit, as I have here from Holiday Ops, oh hello, it's Chuck Norris, or from your campaign missions or whatever, usually people recommend recruit them as a commander, because then A, you can have 6th sense generally straight from the off, and also your commander tends to be a very pressurised crew member, i.e. there are lots of commander skills that you want, and those special crew members get skills faster. You could also make a case for recruiting a gunner, who is, in this tank, who is also a shiny crew member, because your gunner does the job of a loader as well, so there are more crew skills you're going to want. Just something that's worth bearing in mind. So what crew skills do you want? Well, there's nothing that's going to really surprise you here. It's your standard repairs, 6th sense, brothers in arms. I will, however, note, because this thing actually gets, for a medium tank, a pretty respectable camouflage value to start off with, and because this thing is so fragile, I would say there is definitely a case for making a higher priority on camo as a skill than you might ordinarily. Just something worth bearing in mind. Even without safe stowage, I've never had this thing blow up in my face, so I don't think safe stowage is that important. It certainly doesn't seem that important to me. But yeah, they are my thoughts on your crew skills. Let me just check I haven't missed anything. Crew skills, equipment, consumables, and the grind. And I think that's quite enough of me waffling. Let's go and blow things up. Gameplay time then, and as normal we're going to have one match where we're top tier and one where we're bottom tier. So we're kicking off with our top tier game. We are here in a tier 5 match, obviously, but we've got some tier 4s to shoot at, so it is the best matchmaking you're going to see, as tier 5s don't see tier 3s anymore. You might have noticed from the ping, by the way, I'm having some internet related problems here, which is why I'm a little bit slow to start. And we're here on Prokhorovka. Is it actually Prokhorovka or Fiery Salient? Prokhorovka. There we go, we finally get moving. So, big, wide, open map. And we're on the south spawn. It's an encounter game. So there's kind of two positions I'm tossing up going to, and the fact that I load in quite late, or that I'm able to do something quite late, kind of dictates what I'm going to do. So position 1, I could have gone up toward the hill on the sort of 9-0 lines and tried to fight it out over there. Alternatively, I could do what I'm actually going to do and come over to the mid-ridge, and I'm going to try and set up a crossfire with the hill by coming over to this sort of central location here. Now, it's worth pointing out there are no light tanks in this game. Well, there are no light tanks on our team. The enemy do have a looks. So, those of you who have some experience of playing Prokhorovka, straight away, although he's a tier 4, not a tier 5, it's probably worth mentioning that if that looks has a decent game, this could be over quite quickly. The fact that they've got a light tank on the enemy team on a map that really likes light tanks does very much give the enemy team an advantage here. Anyway, trying to see if I can pick out a shot on that T-24, and I do actually, and manage to pick up a nice early kill. And we can see there are lots of bad guys going up toward the hill. So, we've got an early lead for our team, 2 kills to 1. We've lost our T6 medium, that's a tier 4, that's fine, in exchange for a T28 and a T34, and of course, just as I say that, we lose a T28 ourselves. So things are relatively even. You could argue the fact that they've lost a tier 5 and we haven't gives us the slight edge, but that's, to my mind, easily counterbalanced by the fact that they have a light tank on Prokhorovka and we don't. So let's not get too excited. Going for a shot on this Wolverine, and of course he stops. And now we have to reload. And again, the reload may not look too painful on this gun, especially if you're used to playing higher tiers. It's around, it doesn't show it on replays, which is slightly annoying, but as I said in the garage, it's around the 4.5 second mark. And that's not completely awful, but when you combine that, there we go, 95, with the really underwhelming 99 alpha damage on this gun, the average is 110, but that means you can happily roll for less than 100. It does actually make this thing quite frustrating to use because, as I mentioned in the garage, you take so long to do any sort of meaningful damage. 117, slightly high damage roll, and we're not going to get another shot. You know, if I were in... Okay, I was playing this... I played the Chinu a little bit before playing this. Played a batch of games in that. If I were in a Chinu, I would have a slightly quicker reload. Oh, that one missed. And I would be hitting for an average of 125 instead of 110 every single time I pulled the trigger. Missed. This thing is relatively accurate for a tier 5 medium tank, but again, how much difference does that actually make a lot of the time? You know, accuracy isn't the most meaningful stat in this game. Hello Panzer 3J. Now this map of course is the sort of map where you tend to be taking more shots at longer range than you might on some other maps. So having half decent accuracy is more important on Prokhorovka than it is on a lot of maps, to be fair. And I think as far as maps go, Prokhorovka is probably relatively good for the Skoda. So this is kind of a best case scenario for the tank. You're on a map that I think it does reasonably well on. Oh, it's a Matilda. And we've got the best matchmaking we're going to get. There's no artillery in this match, by the way, so we're not going to have a French, whatever the hell you call it, hitting us for 75% of our health and then reloading in, 7 seconds or something. When playing this tank, that machine was a nightmare, despite the fact it hasn't been sold for a while as far as I know. There's still a lot of those around. Many people seem to have them, which is kind of annoying. Maybe I'd have done better with artillery in this game, I don't know. Matilda, there we go. 132 penetration is enough to generally deal with the front of his turret. And just to say that, of course, we bounce, but hey-ho. You'll have noticed, by the way, this match has gone decidedly south. And I'm not waiting to aim at the Matilda, because I'm just worried about getting shot by all of his friends. Can I pick out a shot on the T1 Heavy? Okay, just trying to see if I can pick out a shot on the Matilda as well. The T1 Heavy isn't advanced enough, hasn't gone forward enough for me to easily pick out a shot on him. I have to go a little bit further along this ridge than I would really like to. I get spotted, but I do manage to put a shot into him, but for all that effort it was 115. We get some assistance on the Matilda though, and he is done, so that is something. Scoreline is 6-10. Oh, and there's a VK. Yeah, no, that's not going to do anything. We actually bounce a shot there. Oh, which is a little bit miraculous. Again, you can bounce the odd shot here or there at quirky angles, but you shouldn't expect to be bouncing anything. Can I pick out a shot on the KV-1? It looks like there might be a wreck in front of him, which is really annoying. Yeah, no, that's going to be really problematic. Hello, Mr. VK. No, we miss. And we've now got a Wolverine shooting us in the butt. We can't effectively engage the KV, T40 or VK. because we'll get spotted and we'll get shot from the hill because we don't actually control all the hill yet. We control the top of the hill, but we don't control the rise leading up to it, and they're able to shoot me from there. So, trying to get shots on this KV-1. Aim, 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 aim. There we go. 120. Aim, 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 aim. There we go. Oh, we actually set him on fire for a bit more damage. But now it's actually becoming quite difficult to pick a shot out, because there isn't much of him to shoot. It's just his turret, which at this sort of range is going to be awkward, basically. Can we get anything else on this? Oh, Panzer III. I'm trying to just help this tank destroyer stay alive as long as I possibly can. But, you know, again, the accuracy is decent on this gun when fully aimed. But you're still a tier 5 medium. Your accuracy is still not very good. And we're down to 15 rounds of armor-piercing ammo, in case you hadn't noticed. And we're going to have a rectal VK in a moment. If we're not careful, we get spotted. We just can't engage that T1 heavy. Now, this obviously is a situation where the team in general has not done very well. Fine, you know, these things happen. But I'm just trying to point out how this thing plays. You can see we're mobile enough, we've got decent mobility, we've got decent gun depression to be hitting these guys over ridge lines. But the gun, it's just not quite there, which is a shame. And I'm trying to, if this, the problem is it's difficult to see what sort of, there we go, we finally get the VK, what sort of gun, or what sort of tank this gun would be good on. Because if you're in a kind of brawling medium, this gun doesn't have either the alpha damage or the DPM to make people afraid of you. So this sort of gun is best on this kind of tank, but for a tier 5 medium, the gun is just not very good. Ram on the Panzer there, and yeah, we're done. It is what it is. We managed to go down swinging at least. Now, I'm not going to make you watch the rest of this game. This game actually goes on for a little while. The P43 and the M10 on our team, to be fair to them, put up a respectable fight from the hill. And we do actually get into the position where our team could have won. It ends up with the P43 and he's left versus, I think it's the T1 Heavy and the Panzer IIIJ, or it might be one of the tank destroyers, I can't remember. He plays, I'll put it this way, he plays for his own damage rather than playing for the win. And they cap out, if memory serves. And they might actually kill him at about the same time. Anyway, point is, we lose. Let's have a look at the post-game stats. So, there we go then. Like I said, the enemy team actually ended up capping, and it was our Panzer... It was the enemy Panzer IIIJ, among other people, who was alive at the end of that game. Still, a decent result for us, to be fair. Third class mastery, but it was on a defeat and we didn't get any heroic resistance or anything. 5 for effect, and a bruiser medal, along with 25 bonds for something or other. I'm not going to complain. If you have a look at how each team performed, just across the board, generally speaking, the enemy team did better than us. You just have to have a look at the damage numbers to come to that conclusion. With the exception of the top 4 or 5 players on our team. So the top 5 players on our team did better than the top 5 players on the enemy team. And that's great. But the rest of their team just outperformed us. In fact, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If we exclude the top 5 players on our team, there are only 5 other players in the game who did any damage whatsoever. Just was not a good team, unfortunately. Or maybe the enemy team just outplayed us. To be fair, it's tier 5. There could be lots of new people. Anyway, we finished second on our team by experience and third by damage done. Shout out to the M10 there, by the way. 880 base experience before you add in any heroic resistance, 7 kills, 2,500 damage at tier 5 is a really nice result. And shout out should also go to the M8A1 and the Panzer Soufflé 1C. Respectable damage results from them, even though they weren't top tier. P43, good amount of damage, but quite a lot of that was done when the game was likely already lost. And like I say, he didn't really play for a win at the end, but it is what it is. I can't be too harsh on him. And on the enemy team, no one really stands out except possibly the KV-1 with 1800 damage, and the T1 Heavy, 1100 of his own damage, and some assistance. But it's just one of those times when the enemy team overall is better than yours. And here's that gun performance for you. And this is Prokhorovka. A lot of those shots were taken at pretty long range. 35 shots fired, 18 hits, 13 penetrations. Now, I have a Prokhorovka game that I'm going to show you at some point, where I'm in the Chi-Nu. I'm comparing the two because I played the two tanks quite a lot, you know, in a similar sort of time period. And so the match I'm thinking of is a tier 7 game for the Chi-Nu. And we played a similar sort of game, but instead of 1400 damage and 600 assistance, we racked up 1700 damage and about 2000 assistance. So the point I'm trying to make is, despite the fact that this gun on paper is one of the most accurate, if not the most accurate, tier 5 medium tank guns, and despite the fact that it has the highest base penetration of any tier 5 medium tank, we did more damage in a similar game when bottom tier in the Chi-Nu than we did in this thing top tier. And the sort of shots we had were not too radically dissimilar. Long story short, you cannot rely on this gun, unfortunately. Anyway, 1402 damage done, of which about 1000 was from more than 300 meters. We received 21 hits, but bear in mind a lot of those were from an autocannon, so autocannon at some range would bounce on a piece of paper. That doesn't say anything about our armor. So please don't take the armor performance in this game to be indicative of how you should expect the armor to hold out. I could have shown you games where I was penetrated with 105mm howitzers from Panzer IVs and Shermans. That's more what, and that's using HE, and that's more what this armor is like. It will bounce at quirky angles, and that's about it. 457 damage blocked by our armour. That is very unusual for this tank. One enemy vehicle spotted, 8 damage, 2 destroyed, 633 assistance, and about 2 kilometres travelled. It's a tier 5, we still made a respectable profit of 27,000 credits. And we made a reasonable amount of XP. We were running a premium account at the time because of some premium account reward from a mission over the Christmas period or something like that. I can't remember the exact reason. Yeah, so that's kind of as good as it's going to get on a map that you'd think it should be pretty good on, with what should be pretty good matchmaking, and we managed 1400 damage, but it wasn't enough to pull our team over the winning line, and when it came down to it, and when we were under pressure, just never feels in this tank that you have the tools to pull your team with you. You're always very dependent on your team's performance, more so than you are in some other tier 5 medium tanks. Anyway, I've got another bit of gameplay for you, which of course will be a tier 7 match. So, tier 7 match, and you might notice that again we're on quite an open map. This is of course Miravanka, home of the magic forest that kind of got napalmed a few years ago. Now, when you're bottom tier, you kind of need to adjust your expectations a little bit. I'm not expecting a tier 5 tank to have the tools to carry a tier 7 match. So what you're really looking for is more, can I support the other tanks on my team? Can I help them win? Now, I'm going to do something in this game that's a little bit risky, but given that I'm bottom tier, I feel that it is worthwhile just to have a go at, because if I die, I'm only tier 5, it's not the end of the world, but I could have a pretty good game here. I'm going to go up to some bushes and try and do some early spotting, and you're going to notice the sort of thing I experienced a lot when playing this. Maybe the fact that I was playing it over the Christmas period makes much of a difference. So before I even get into the bushes, get spotted, and there's a type T-24 on the enemy team who is just YOLOing. And, I mean, this is a bad play from him, but I wiggle a bit to try and avoid as many shots as I can. Like, he's giving his tank away. This is a terrible play, but frustratingly, it completely messes up what I wanted to do. That was a terrible shot. And there we go. So my initial play isn't going to work out, or hasn't worked out, because a YOLOing Type T-24 spots me. I lose, well, over half my health in the process. This is not a very good start to the game. So the rest of this match, I'm going to have to play even more cagily than I normally would in this damn tank. It's just frustrating, and like I say, I experienced that sort of thing quite a lot while playing this. Now, thankfully in this particular scenario, ooh, I got spotted, so I took the shot and backed off. In this particular scenario, the Type T-34 didn't actually seem to have any interest in going for me. But what I experienced quite a lot while playing this tank was people deciding to go full YOLO, who cares, and coming to kill me if I took an advanced position. And this happened in Tier 5 maximum games, Tier 6, Tier 7. The matchmaking didn't really seem to make much difference. Now the problem is, that if I was in another Tier 5 medium tank that had greater damage output, or that had a bit of armour to work with, a T-34, or a Sherman, or a Panzer IV, or even a Chinook, or really any other Tier 5 medium tank, I would have the firepower to fight my way out of that sort of situation, at least if it were against equal or lower tier opponents. I'm not saying I'd be able to outfight a top tier tank in a straight up one-on-one engagement, but against higher tier opponents, you'd have the firepower to teach them that was a bad idea. But in this I found you just don't. You don't have the firepower to do that, and you don't have the durability. And so someone can, and in my experience did, YOLO you, and if your team don't help, you're screwed a lot of the time, which means it's so frustrating to play this thing. I've been trying to put my finger on what I think my main problem with this tank is, or trying to describe what I think the problem with this tank is, and I think the best way I can put it is that it feels like you're playing a tank that should have quite a high skill cap. You're mobile, you've got 10 degrees of gun depression, you're fragile. All that makes it feel like you need to avoid getting shot. You need to use bushes and game mechanics and all this other good stuff. But the difference is, when you do all that, you don't actually do much. That you put all that effort into trying to play this thing well, and to try to be cautious and careful, and the end result is you get a couple hundred damage because the gun just doesn't output much damage. There we go, I need to back off because I've been spotted, and I get shot in the face with the AT2. Thankfully he wasn't using the howitzer. And you just struggle to have much of an impact on a game, even when you think, I've actually played this quite well, quite cautiously, quite carefully. You know, I've been as aggressive as I feel I could be. But even when you do that, nope. Nope. Hello, Mr. T-25 AT, that's a bit aggressive from you. You just don't have the tools to make that much of an impact on the game. That's what it feels like, and that's basically, as far as I can work out, describing quite a bad tank. Because you have the disadvantages of a high skill cap tank without the advantages, i.e. being able to prod buttock. Maybe there's something I'm missing, so I would be interested to know what anyone's thoughts on this tank are that have played this thing. Anyway, back to the game in question. While I've been whittering on for the last few minutes, the game has actually kind of swung back and forth quite a bit, and the scoreline is currently 10-9. I have 179 hit points left, which basically puts me in a one-shot range for everything. Assuming the KV-1's using the 85mm gun, okay, you'd have to high roll to one-shot me, but the point still stands. Hello, Mr. IS. Nope. Alright, so what can I do? Well, let's firstly try and keep this SU-100M1 alive. Well, okay, someone else shut down the Skoda. I mean, he's probably fine, but I'm just trying to make myself useful. There we go, deal with the IKV. And we're now 12-9 up, and there's an IS KV-1 and a Gorilla left on the enemy team. Okay, so what can we do? Well, we saw the IS, we know roughly where he is. Neither the Griller nor the KV-1 have actually been spotted yet. Now in the case of the Griller, that's not particularly surprising. He's an SPG at the end of the day, there goes the IS. But in the case of a KV-1, not spotted. It's not exactly a stealthy tank, which indicates to me either A, he's AFK, or B, he is camping hard. So, at this point, there aren't many tanks left on each team. There's no real chance of a hard camping / AFK KV-1 dealing with a pretty much full health SU-100 M1, so I'm just going to go and try and spot things. If I die, then I die. There's the KV-1. He's got his gun up in salute, so I think he's AFK. But then, it looks like I thought I saw his gun turret turn, I think. Yeah, he's not actually a bot. Well, I bounced on the side of his turret. Wonderful. He's not, well, he might be a bot, but he's not actually AFK. That was curious. And, yeah, we bounced on the side of his turret, unfortunately, because this gun is so good. And then we're just going to go after artillery. We're loading high explosive, but unfortunately, basically the artillery is behind a little ridge line, and we're not gonna... I'm going to try a shot, but we're not going to manage to do anything before he dies. And that was the game. So let's have a look at the post-game stats for this one. So, although it didn't seem like we did a great deal in that match, because frankly, we didn't, you do have to remember that if you're shooting equal and higher tier tanks a lot of the time, then you're going to get more experience. And we also did our fair share of spotting, which is nice. So that actually ended up being a second-class mastery and fire for effect, so we at least did as much damage as we had hit points, which is usually my kind of watershed for the game didn't completely suck. Unless I'm in like artillery or something. So we finished 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th on our team by experience, which isn't too bad as we were bottom tier anyway. And with 594 base XP. We did better than any of the other tier 5s in the game, so can't really complain. Shout out to our VK3601H there with over 2,500 damage even though he wasn't top tier, so well done to him. So yeah, nothing spectacular in that game, but just sort of steadily trying to help our team. 18 shots fired, 9 hits, 6 pens for that 693 damage, most of which was actually from relatively close range. We received 3 hits. Our armour, it did nothing, they all went through. Thankfully, all those hits were from relatively small caliber guns. I think there was 1 hit from the AT2, who was using the 6-pounder. 1 hit from a T-34-85 using the 85mm gun, and maybe 1 hit from Stritzwang 74 with his 75mm or something like that. If there'd been bigger tanks shooting us like an IS, that would not have been that many shots. 3 enemy vehicles spotted, 6 damaged, 1 destroyed, 603 assistance damage, 3.5 kilometers travelled. And again, we were running a premium account at the time because, yay, Christmas missions and whatnot. 26,000 credit profit. And again, missions giving us lots of experience because Christmas. So that ended up being an okay game. You know, we're just trying to help our team to get a win there, really. So let's just go back to the garage and give my concluding thoughts on this tank. One of the nice things about doing tank reviews is it allows me to put into words the strengths or weaknesses of a tank. That sounds like it's stating the obvious, but to come up with kind of a way of trying to work out why I like or dislike a tank in many instances. This one, I think I've got it down to a relatively pithy little phrase. Wargaming took the characteristics of a medium tank and a light tank and gave the T-24 the worst of both. So, just to demonstrate my point, this is comparing the T-24 with the M24 Chaffee, the American Tier 5 light tank. I've picked that one because it's a Tier 5 light tank with a 75mm gun, basically. Here are the statistics. Green is where the Skoda is better, red is where the American Chaffee is better. Now I'm comparing a medium and a light tank. What you would expect is something along the lines of the medium tank has better durability in terms of armour and hit points, and a better gun, and the light tank has better mobility and better sort of scouting ability in terms of view range and camouflage and all this jazz. So let's just actually have a look. We're going to start down here at the bottom right, just to be contrary. So the Chaffee has a better radio range, but who cares? Better view range, better camouflage. This is all what we would expect. The Chaffee's lighter, fine, or whatever. Keep going, blah 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 blah. The Chaffee has fewer hit points, but only by 40. It only has 40 fewer hit points, which might be enough to allow the Skoda to take an extra hit. Maybe. The Chaffee actually has better track armour. Go figure. In terms of the armour on the hull and the turret, the Chaffee is worse, but only just. There's not actually much in it. So, the Chaffee does have worse durability, but we'll come back to that in a moment. And the Chaffee, it's only just worse durability, and the Chaffee definitely has better sort of scouting characteristics. Okay, what about mobility? Well, we'd expect the light tank to be winning here, and it is, let's not beat around the bush. These values are all much better on the Chaffee than they are on the Skoda, fine. So the Skoda is more durable, but it's worth pointing out only just more durable, and the better mobility and camo on the Chaffee will help keep it alive. And the Chaffee has better scouting characteristics. So it all comes down to the gun, and we would expect the Skoda to have a better gun, and you might be noticing quite a lot of red here. So the Skoda has just under 1300 base DPM. The Chaffee has over 1500. The Skoda has better penetration. They have the same alpha damage. So you have the same alpha damage and worse DPM than a same tier light tank. You got better penetration. Whoop-de-doop. You are better in one statistic, that the Chaffee can double press 2 to mitigate. And you take longer to reload, hence the worse DPM. You have a worse aim time, better fully aimed accuracy, worse dispersion on moving, turning the turret, and turning the tank, and after firing the gun, and a better shell velocity. So I'd say if you're being generous, you'd say the guns are kind of an even match, with the better DPM and damage output of the Chaffee being offset against the better accuracy and penetration of the Skoda. But honestly, I think the better aiming stats, reload, outweigh the better fully aimed accuracy and penetration on the Skoda. So this thing, in my opinion, is slower than the Chaffee. The armour and durability is vaguely comparable. It's not as good at scouting as a Chaffee, and it has arguably a worse gun than the Chaffee. I think you can see where I'm going with that. And this is a massive shame, because I really wanted to like this tank. It's mobile for a medium tank. It has 10 degrees of gun depression, you know, I can work with this, but it's just so much effort to squeeze out not very much. And you put in all this effort trying to position carefully, trying not to put yourself in a place where you're going to get shot, trying to use view range or camouflage and all this jazz, and you still achieve very little a lot of the time. It's a very frustrating tank to play, because it feels like it should have more. It feels like it should be able to do something when you play it well, and I can't avoid the conclusion that this thing is just poor. In fact, I would go as far to say that it is a strong contender for the worst Tier 5 medium tank in the game, and actually a strong contender for worst Tier 5. Full stop. Just something to think about. So, in case you hadn't worked it out, I have not enjoyed my time with the Skoda. I've had some decent games in it, but overall it's been a fairly painful experience. And out of curiosity, I've had a look around, and I'm not the only one who doesn't like this thing. Which seems a shame. First Czechoslovakian tank I've actually reviewed on this channel. I've been slowly hacking my way up the Czechoslovakian tech tree. It's been quite hard going, because the Tier 4 is utter garbage. The Tier 2 is nondescript. It's so generic. It's basically a carbon copy of the Panzer 35, because it basically is a Panzer 35. That was a the Panzer 35T was a Czechoslovakian tank at the end of the day. The most interesting point so far has been the Tier 3 with its little 3-round pop-pop-pop autoloader. Tier 6, Skoda T-24 looks like it might be quite good fun, but we're not there yet, are we? And I still need to ace this blasted thing. So, yeah. If you are looking at the Czechoslovakian tech tree, so far I don't have particularly great things to say about it, but Tier 5 is definitely, in my humble opinion, a bit of a stinker. Anyway, I'm not going to waffle on about it anymore. I hope you found this review vaguely interesting or informative. If you did, by all means feel free to catch some of my other videos, subscribe to my channel, there's a link to Discord in the video description, there's a link to Patreon in the video description, and just have fun. Enjoy. And I hope you enjoy some of the videos that I put out. Anyway, I'll leave it there, and I wish you very happy hunting on that battlefield. Ciao, ciao.